On March 12, 1944, a single entry appeared in a Japanese Imperial Army shipping log. Specimens, 12 containers. Destination classified. No names, no explanations. Just one word scrawled in the margin. Maruta, a code meaning log used to strip human beings of identity and reduce them to inventory. This was no clerical anomaly. Surviving fragments from Unit 731 reveal an entire hidden trade: organs sealed in jars, amputated limbs packed in formaldehyde, torsos shipped in steel drums, all catalogued as samples, all moved under the cover of military logistics. Excavations at Pingfang, decades later, unearthed incineration pits filled with bone shards, surgical tools warped by fire, and glass jars faintly etched with specimen numbers. Each fragment tells the same story. This was not only human experimentation, it was a supply chain, a flesh economy disguised as science. The secrecy was deliberate. At the war's end, commanders burned files, liquidated captives, and dismantled laboratories. Yet silence is never perfect. Misfiled reports, smuggled manifests, and survivor testimony reveal glimpses of a shadow network that should not exist, a machinery of disappearance operating with bureaucratic precision. And still, the fragments surface, a document in one archive, a testimony in another, a jar pulled from frozen soil. Together they form a puzzle that refuses completion but demands recognition. What institution could turn the human body into freight? How far did the network of specimens reach? And who allowed it to vanish into silence? This is Fear Classified. Subscribe to uncover the conspiracies history tried to erase and the shadows that refuse to stay buried. The answer lies in Pingfang, but Pingfang is only the beginning. In the decades leading up to the 1930s, Japan transformed from a regional power into an empire driven by expansion and domination. Its military and bureaucratic institutions grew into apparatuses of control that demanded new forms of resource extraction, not only minerals, crops, and land, but the bodies of human beings. The system that would culminate in Unit 731's biological program was built upon earlier experiments in conquest and governance, where occupied territories were reduced to laboratories for the state. Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95 marked the beginning of a new imperial identity. Taiwan was seized, Korea placed under increasing domination, and the Liaodong Peninsula briefly occupied. The Japanese state justified these moves under the rhetoric of modernization and civilization, presenting itself as the leading force in Asia destined to challenge Western powers. Yet behind the rhetoric lay an empire hungry for both resources and strategic footholds. Each conquest brought more people under surveillance, and with them, new opportunities for exploitation. By the 1930s, following the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the empire reached into the industrial heartlands of northern China. Manchukuo, a puppet state installed under Japanese direction, became a vast testing ground. Its cities were reorganized along colonial lines, Japanese settlers and administrators in secured zones, Chinese populations relegated to controlled districts, all under the watch of military police. The imperial system functioned not only to extract coal and steel, but to reorganize entire populations as resources. The logic was clear. People themselves could be harvested, catalogued, and put to use. In Tokyo, the Japanese Army Medical School became a center of a new ideology, that science must serve the war state. The rise of militarist factions within government ensured that medical research aligned with strategies of conquest. Disease, once regarded as a problem of health, was reframed as a weapon of war. Pathology laboratories expanded under military funding, with young surgeons and bacteriologists pressed into service. In this climate, experimentation on human beings became thinkable, then permissible, then institutionalized. Documents reveal that by 1932, General Shiro Ishii, a physician with ambition and connections, had already begun petitioning for large-scale human experimentation facilities. He argued that Western powers were secretly developing biological weapons, and Japan could not afford to fall behind. His proposals found eager ears in the general staff, who viewed disease as a strategic multiplier. One plague outbreak could cripple enemy cities, undermine resistance, and secure territory without conventional fighting. Ishii's vision required human subjects. The empire, with its occupied territories, supplied them. Harbin, in Manchuria, became the locus of this vision. Already an industrial hub with Soviet-built rail lines and a diverse population of Russians, Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese settlers, Harbin offered both infrastructure and anonymity. The district of Pingfang, just outside the city, was transformed into a restricted compound. Barbed wire, watchtowers, and rail sidings enclosed what outwardly appeared to be a military factory. Inside, laboratories and operating theaters were constructed with precision. Cold storage vaults, incinerators, and dissection rooms were added, architecture designed for the systematic breakdown of human bodies. The population of Manchuria, especially the Chinese peasantry, were placed at the disposal of this machine. Poverty, war displacement, and political repression created a surplus of the vulnerable, the poor, the homeless, and prisoners accused of sabotage or espionage. Arrests swelled under arbitrary charges. Local police, operating under Japanese supervision, delivered captives to military custody. Each arrival was entered into camp records not as a name, but as a number. Once inside, the individual was stripped of identity and reclassified as material. Survivors later described the methodical nature of these transfers. Families vanished overnight after house-to-house raids. Men were taken from rural villages under suspicion of guerrilla ties. Some women and children disappeared from urban markets, never to return. The system required secrecy, but also continuity. A constant flow of new captives ensured that the laboratories never stood idle. In this manner, the occupied society itself was harvested, its members reduced to inputs for experimentation. It was within this framework that the term Maruta emerged. Outwardly it appeared innocuous. Log, a metaphor for material used in construction. Inside Unit 731, it became code for human subjects. The choice of word was not accidental. Logs were cut, stacked, processed, and burned. The same logic now applied to human beings. The euphemism created distance between action and atrocity, allowing surgeons, administrators, and guards to speak of their work in neutral terms. A manifest could list logs without raising alarm, even as it documented the destruction of human life. According to sealed files examined after the war, the Maruta system did not end at Pingfang. The very language of specimen and material made it possible to distribute bodies across a network of facilities without ever naming the dead. Human remains could be inventoried like chemicals, transported like medical supplies, and consumed by research programs scattered across the empire. The horror was not merely local, it was systemic, woven into the fabric of military science. Officially, the empire presented its medical campaigns as humanitarian, public pay. Posters in occupied cities proclaimed sanitation drives, vaccination programs, and modern waterworks. Japanese officers posed as benefactors bringing hygiene to backward lands. But beneath this mask of progress, coercive measures ensured compliance. Villages suspected of harboring disease were burned. Populations were forcibly relocated. The veneer of health concealed a deeper truth. Populations were being manipulated to serve as experimental fields. Archaeological findings confirm the material infrastructure of this deception. Remains of water wells seeded with cholera bacilli, ditches lined with lime, and abandoned ceramic bombs designed to spread plague-infected fleas have been uncovered in Chinese countryside decades after the war. These artifacts demonstrate that what was described as public health was often biological warfare testing in disguise. The populations who suffered were not protected subjects, but expendable test material. The machinery of atrocity required paperwork. Each prisoner processed into Pingfang was logged. Each specimen removed from an operating table was catalogued. Each shipment leaving the compound bore signatures of approval from officers, clerks, and transport officials. The records were designed to appear routine, yet within the neutrality of bureaucratic form lay the means of erasure, names replaced by numbers, deaths recorded as completion of procedure, organs listed as samples. Documents reveal that this paperwork was distributed across multiple institutions. Regional hospitals received coded shipments. Naval research centers requested material for studies on frostbite or gas exposure. Procurement officers ensured containers moved discreetly along supply chains. At every stage, the system depended on language that concealed its meaning. The structure of bureaucracy itself became an accomplice, transforming murder into administration. Beyond science, there was profit. Military contracts rewarded officers who secured steady supplies of specimens. Laboratories received funding proportional to their output of reports and data. Even the disposal of remains became a form of resource management. Bones were ground and incinerated to conceal evidence, yet tissue samples preserved in jars were valued commodities, exchanged between units. A shadow economy emerged, invisible to civilian populations yet embedded in the war machine. In this hidden market, human remains circulated as both scientific material and a form of bureaucratic currency. According to testimonies gathered decades later, surplus organs and blood were sometimes traded to regional hospitals under the pretense of legitimate research. These transactions left faint traces in medical ledgers, sudden spikes in available donor tissue, unexplained shipments noted as military sample. Though few such records survive intact, the fragments suggest a system larger than Pingfang, one integrated into the Empire's medical establishment as a whole. Why then did so few speak? The answer lies in the architecture of secrecy. Unit 731 and its satellite facilities were classified under the highest security protocols. Guards were ordered to execute any escapees. Local witnesses were silenced through intimidation or disappearance. Japanese staff signed oaths of secrecy, violations of which were punishable by death. This culture of silence extended beyond the war, reinforced by occupation politics and Cold War calculations. The United States, eager to secure Japan as an ally, suppressed much of the evidence in exchange for access to the data. Silence was preserved, not broken. Yet silence itself leaves traces. Gaps in archives, sudden disappearances in census records, and unexplained mortality in occupied villages point toward the system that official narratives concealed. These absences, when collected, form their own kind of testimony. They speak to the scale of a program that consumed thousands of lives, yet left only fragments of documentation. The horror lies not only in what is known, but in what remains unrecorded. The historical context of Unit 731 is one of empire, militarism, science, and bureaucracy converging into a machinery that rendered human beings as material. It is within this convergence that the Maruta Manifests gain meaning. A single manifest listing 12 containers of specimens is not an anomaly. It is the tip of a larger structure of movement and exchange. To understand the full scope, one must trace the patterns across records, testimonies, and archaeological remains. The Empire's ideology declared that sacrifice of the few could secure the future of the many, but in Pingfang, sacrifice was not symbolic. It was literal, systematic, and hidden beneath layers of euphemism. The context reveals that the atrocities of Unit 731 were not aberrations of war, but products of an institutional system designed to transform flesh into data and death into resource. This is the world in which the first incident unfolds. And yet, the first incident recorded is not the first that occurred. The earliest documented case that survives in archives begins not with a name, but with a number. A prisoner processed through Pingfang's gates, erased from life, and reconstituted as material. The file that remains is incomplete, but its fragments open the path into the system's core. The earliest surviving file in the fragmented Unit 731 archive bears no name. Its cover sheet, preserved in partial form, lists only a prisoner number, a date of transfer, and the initials of the officer who signed the intake. The entry is dated August 10, 1939. The location, Pingfang, Manchuria. The notation describes the arrival of a single captive transported under military guard from Harbin Municipal Prison. The charge is not specified. Instead, the file marks the prisoner as special transfer, a category that historians later discovered served as code for human experimentation subjects. Documents reveal that the prisoner was one of many swept up in a wave of arrests following alleged sabotage on the South Manchurian Railway. Dozens of Chinese civilians were accused of collaboration with guerrilla forces. Interrogation records from Harbin Prison show routine beatings and confessions extracted under duress. The prisoner in question, listed only as Specimen number 87, was transferred directly after interrogation to Pingfang, bypassing normal judicial processes. In the official ledger, this movement was recorded not as a legal procedure, but as consignment. Survivors later described the transport procedure. Captives bound for Pingfang were shackled, loaded into covered trucks, and delivered under military escort. They were not permitted contact with other prisoners. Upon arrival, guards stripped them of possessions, shaved their heads, and issued plain cotton uniforms without insignia. Names were not spoken. Numbers were written on cards affixed to the uniforms. The prisoner became number 87, an identity erased and replaced by code. According to sealed files recovered decades later, the intake process included mandatory medical examination. Blood was drawn, weight recorded, body temperature noted. These measurements were not for the prisoner's welfare, but for baseline data collection. In the case of number 87, the intake sheet lists blood group, lung capacity, and dental condition. Each metric appears in neat columns beside the surgeon's initials. There is no record of consent, no acknowledgement of the prisoner's will. From the first moment, the human being existed only as data. The file fragment next records transfer to Experiment Hall B. The description is vague, but architectural plans of Pingfang confirm that Hall B contained dissection rooms and surgical theatres. Testimonies from former staff reveal that Hall B was reserved for live experiments requiring surgical intervention. Number 87 was delivered there within 48 hours of arrival. The speed of transfer suggests premeditation. The subject was not held in a cell for long. From the beginning, this prisoner had been designated for immediate use. The first procedure noted is a thoracic inoculation. Medical terminology conceals the reality. Exposure to pathogens directly injected into the chest cavity. Documents reveal that plague bacilli were frequently introduced in this manner, with progression monitored daily. The file records rising temperature, elevated heart rate, and eventual pulmonary collapse. The notations are precise, almost detached. At no point is the prisoner described as suffering. Instead, the language of science abstracts the process into numbers. Fever of 39.2, pulse 134, breathing irregular. These metrics replace the human experience of agony. Survivors later described how prisoners undergoing inoculation were confined to isolation cells. Guards delivered food through slots in the door. Observation windows allowed staff to monitor the deterioration of the body. In the case of plague, blackened lymph nodes appeared within days. Victims coughed blood, sweated through their thin uniforms, and often collapsed into delirium. Yet in records, such details are reduced to single words: hemoptysis, collapse, expiry. The language of medicine became a shield against the recognition of suffering. The file on number 87 continues with a second entry: necropsy complete. The word conceals the fact that dissection occurred while the body was still alive, a practice corroborated by later testimonies. Unit 731 surgeons insisted that live dissection yielded more accurate data on organ response. The prisoner was strapped to an operating table, chloroform withheld, and the thoracic cavity opened under observation. Records showed timing of organ failure, the sequence of collapse, and the appearance of tissue under plague conditions. The final note lists heart arrest, 14:23 hours. At this moment, number 87 ceased to exist as a living human. Archaeological findings confirm the procedures of disposal. Pits uncovered near Pingfang contained ash mixed with fragments of human bone, lime residue, and remnants of surgical instruments. Cremation was routine. Bodies were reduced to unrecognizable matter to eliminate evidence, yet not everything was destroyed. According to laboratory inventories discovered in Japanese archives, portions of organs were preserved in glass jars and sealed with wax. Some were shipped to secondary facilities. A manifest dated August 20, 1939 records specimen samples 87B through 87F dispatched to Naval Laboratory, Yokohama. Even in death, number 87 was fragmented, divided, and circulated as raw material. The horror of this case lies not only in its brutality, but in its ordinariness. The file contains no unusual markings, no indication that the procedures were exceptional. The structure suggests routine: prisoner intake, inoculation, dissection, disposal, specimen shipment, each step part of an institutional cycle. Number 87 was not chosen for any unique quality. The prisoner was simply available, another unit of material in a system designed to consume human lives. Survivors later described the psychological distance of staff. Surgeons referred to prisoners as logs, guards called them units, and clerks wrote numbers in ledgers with mechanical efficiency. The system insulated individuals from recognizing their victims as human. Language functioned as both disguise and permission. In this context, the destruction of number 87 was not seen as murder, it was procedure. The record fragments hint at a wider network. The manifest documenting shipment of preserved organs proves that Pingfang was not an isolated site. Its products fed into a larger system of laboratories. Naval research centers required tissue for frostbite studies. Air Force hospitals requested blood samples for altitude testing. Chemical divisions demanded organs exposed to toxins. Each institution drew from the pool of victims harvested in Pingfang. No. 87's remains thus became part of a supply chain disseminated across the empire, absorbed into data sets, erased from history except for the file fragments that survived. According to post-war interrogations, Japanese officers insisted that the subjects were condemned criminals, already sentenced to death, yet no judicial record of number 87 exists. The absence of a name in the file, the lack of trial documents, and the arbitrary arrest pattern all point toward deliberate concealment. The designation special transfer appears repeatedly in surviving files, always leading directly to experimentation. The legal justification was fiction. The truth was abduction, erasure, and consumption by the machinery of science. The first incident is thus less a singular event than a template. It reveals the structure of the entire program. Intake erased identity, procedures transformed the body into data, disposal concealed evidence, shipment extended the reach beyond Pingfang. The system required secrecy, but it also required repetition. No, 87 was followed by number 88, then number 89, and on endlessly. The horror is multiplied not by the uniqueness of the incident, but by its ordinariness. Archaeological findings decades later uncovered another layer of truth. In the early 1980s, construction workers near Pingfang unearthed ceramic jars filled with preserved organs. Some bore faded labels with numbers corresponding to intake files. One fragment read 87B. Though degraded, the tissue inside was still recognizable as lung. Laboratory analysis confirmed traces of plague bacilli. This discovery linked physical evidence to archival fragments, confirming that the preserved remains of number 87 had not all been destroyed. Some lay buried, hidden but not erased, waiting to surface decades later. The continuing emergence of such evidence demonstrates the durability of atrocity. No matter how carefully perpetrators attempted to erase their crimes, fragments persist. A manifest misfiled in an archive, a jar buried in soil, a testimony whispered decades later. These pieces reassemble the outline of a system that thrived on destruction. No, 87's case, though fragmentary, exposes the logic of the Maruta program: to transform human beings into consumable parts, to deny them identity, and to distribute their remains as scientific resource. The chilling reality is that this file survived by accident. Thousands of others were incinerated in August 1945 as Japanese officers destroyed archives before surrender. Number 87 is remembered only because one file was overlooked, one manifest misfiled, one jar unearthed. How many others remain unrecorded, their stories obliterated by fire and silence, can never be known. According to sealed files held in American custody after the war, officers who surrendered documents in exchange for immunity revealed that hundreds of such cases were processed monthly. If number 87 represents a single line in the ledger, then behind that line stands an invisible multitude. Each erased name, each destroyed body, each concealed shipment belongs to a latent pattern that transcends individual cases. The first incident thus opens the door to the pattern. It shows how a single life, reduced to number and specimen, became part of a network that reached across the empire. The prisoner disappeared into records, into laboratories, into ash and fragments. But the traces that survive expose the structure of atrocity. No, and 87 was not the beginning and not the end. The machinery continued, accelerating as war expanded, consuming more lives, producing more data, feeding more institutions. The incident is only the first documented fragment. Others wait in the shadows of archives, scattered across continents, buried in soil, and hidden in sealed vaults. And the next file does not describe one prisoner. It describes many, processed together, their numbers climbing into the hundreds, their remains dispersed across the empire's laboratories like a hidden economy of flesh. The fragments that survive from Pingfang suggest not chaos, but rhythm. What first appears as isolated atrocities reveals, under closer examination, the contours of a system. Each prisoner was not merely taken but processed. Each procedure was not improvised but sequenced. Each record, each manifest, each burial site points to a hidden design. The horror does not lie in randomness. It lies in the patterned repetition of destruction. The intake logs illustrate the beginning of this rhythm. Prisoners arrive in groups, delivered under military escort from Harbin, Changchun, or rural police detachments. The files describe them only as transfers, special consignments, or new material. The number varies, sometimes a single captive, sometimes dozens. Yet the intake sheets repeat the same columns of data: age, weight, blood type, lung capacity. Each body was measured in precisely the same way. The act of measurement erased individuality. The numbers could be compared, stored, and cross-referenced. The person disappeared, and only the dataset remained. The next stage of the pattern emerges in the allocation of prisoners to experiment categories. Surviving records identify at least 7 major streams: plague inoculation, cholera ingestion, frostbite exposure, gas chamber testing, dehydration, blood loss studies, and vivisection. Each stream had its own laboratory, its own staff, its own sequence of procedures. Prisoners were not chosen at random. Their bodies were matched to the needs of the experiment. Men were sent to frostbite trials, women to reproductive studies, children to disease inoculation. The allocation shows deliberation, a system that saw in each captive a potential resource to be maximized. Documents reveal that repetition was essential. A single experiment was not considered proof. Procedures were performed dozens of times, sometimes hundreds. Variations were introduced. Different dosages, different environmental conditions, different stages of infection before dissection. Each iteration required new victims. The cycle demanded fresh supply. Arrests in Manchuria and northern China increased in parallel, feeding the hunger of the laboratories. The rhythm of experimentation synchronized with the rhythm of military police operations. The machinery of science and the machinery of occupation worked in tandem. Frostbite trials provide one of the clearest examples of this cycle. Prisoners were stripped and marched into the winter air, their limbs exposed to sub-zero winds. Guards poured water over hands and feet until the skin froze solid. In some cases, limbs were beaten with sticks to confirm the sound of ice inside the flesh. Once frozen, the victims were taken inside for rewarming experiments. Boiling water, open flames, or animal carcasses were used to test different recovery methods. The notes described tissue blackening, gangrene, and eventual amputation. The same procedure was repeated dozens of times, with different temperatures, different durations of exposure, different techniques of rewarming. No attempt was made to save the prisoners. The goal was not recovery, but data. Plague studies followed a similar rhythm. Prisoners were inoculated with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The progression of the disease was documented with meticulous precision: swollen lymph nodes, fevers, delirium, hemorrhaging. When symptoms reached their peak, subjects were dissected alive to examine the organs in real time. The cycle repeated with pneumonic plague, septicemic plague, and mixed strains. In some cases, prisoners were exposed not by injection but by air, confined in chambers with aerosolized bacteria. The results were compared, tabulated, and used to refine methods of biological warfare. The Repet Etienne created a body of knowledge that was considered scientific, though it was built upon the destruction of lives. Cholera trials added another layer. Prisoners were forced to ingest contaminated water. Vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration followed. Some were given potential treatments, others were left to die. The variation of dosage, timing, and fluid replacement created a database of responses. These experiments were not isolated. They formed part of a larger program to weaponize cholera for deployment in occupied territories. The deaths inside Pingfang were trial runs for epidemics planned beyond its walls. Pattern recognition extends beyond the laboratory into the methods of disposal. Records and testimonies confirm that cremation was routine, yet never sufficient. The volume of bodies exceeded the capacity of furnaces. Burial pits were dug, lime poured over corpses, and earth compacted above. Decades later, construction projects uncovered these mass graves. Skeletal remains bore signs of surgical incisions, amputations, and deliberate mutilation. The consistency of these findings across multiple excavation sites confirms that disposal itself followed a system. Ash, lime, burial. Each step designed to erase, repeated until it became mechanical. The pattern also reveals itself in language. Staff consistently referred to prisoners as logs. The metaphor was not casual, it was part of the culture of Pingfang. Prisoners were units of raw material to be cut, measured, consumed, and discarded. In written records, the term Maruta replaced the word for human. This linguistic substitution allowed the rhythm of destruction to proceed without moral friction. Each repetition of the term reinforced the dehumanization. Over time, staff no longer saw victims as individuals, they saw only material. Survivor testimonies corroborate this. Guards spoke casually of delivering 10 logs or cutting up a log today. Doctors described working on fresh material. Clerks recorded consignments, without distinction between food shipments and human deliveries. The language flattened the reality. The repetition of terms concealed the horror in plain sight. What emerges from this recognition is not only a pattern of death, but a pattern of bureaucracy. Each stage was documented: intake forms, medical charts, shipping manifests, cremation records, all filed, stamped, and signed. The structure resembles an industrial process. Raw material enters, procedures are applied, products emerge, waste is disposed of. In Pingfang, the raw material was human life. The products were data, preserved organs, and scientific papers. The waste was ash, bone, and silence. This industrial model extended across the empire. Documents reveal shipments of organs from Pingfang to naval laboratories in Yokohama, army research centers in Tokyo, and medical schools in Kyoto. Each destination required specific samples: lungs infected with plague, kidneys exposed to toxins, livers destroyed by cholera. The shipments prove that Pingfang was not an isolated atrocity, but a node in a larger network. The rhythm of experimentation in Manchuria echoed in distant laboratories, feeding an empire-wide economy of flesh. Pattern recognition also exposes the collaboration between military branches. Unit 731 operated under the Kwantung Army, yet its data circulated among Navy doctors, Air Force researchers, and civilian universities. The lines of separation blurred. The pattern reveals complicity at every level. Guards who delivered prisoners, surgeons who dissected them, clerks who filed reports, generals who authorized funding, professors who cited the data in scientific journals. The horror is not confined to a secret facility. It radiates outward, implicating institutions across the empire. One chilling element of the pattern lies in its invisibility during the war. Reports were disguised as agricultural research, public health studies, or epidemic prevention projects. The very name of Unit 731, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, masked its reality. Documents were classified under innocuous titles. Shipments of organs were labeled as biological samples. Staff were told they were serving the empire by preventing disease. The repetition of euphemism mirrored the repetition of atrocity. Words became camouflage, hiding murder behind the language of science. After the war, the pattern continued in another form. When Allied investigators questioned Japanese doctors, many denied involvement. Yet American intelligence officers offered immunity in exchange for data. Files that survived the fires of 1945 were transferred to U.S. custody. The repetition of concealment continued. Atrocity was buried beneath the rhetoric of scientific value. Victims disappeared not only into ash, but into archives hidden from public view. The pattern of erasure extended beyond the empire into the politics of occupation. What emerges then is a structure that begins with a single prisoner and expands outward until it encompasses an empire and a post-war order. The individual case of number 87 was not an anomaly. It was one iteration in a repeating sequence. Intake, experiment, disposal, shipment. The rhythm played on thousands of times. Each repetition erased another life. But each also left fragments. A mislabeled jar, a misfiled manifest, a scar in the earth where bones surface decades later. These fragments accumulate, forming their own counterpattern. The silence of archives is interrupted by the persistence of evidence. Archaeological digs in the 1980s uncovered ceramic jars, surgical tools, and skeletal remains. The jars bore faded numbers matching intake records. The tools matched descriptions in testimony. The bones bore cuts identical to surgical diagrams. These discoveries confirmed that the pattern of atrocity was not merely textual but material. The earth itself retained the rhythm. Each excavation became another iteration of remembrance, countering the repetition of concealment with the repetition of exposure. The true terror of the pattern is its impersonality. In ordinary crime, motive is rooted in individual desire, hatred, or impulse. In Pingfang, motive dissolved into process. Victims were consumed not because of who they were, but because the system required more data. Murder became routine, integrated into daily schedules, aligned with research goals. The perpetrators did not need to hate their victims. They needed only to follow procedure. This is the essence of institutional horror, atrocity committed not in passion, but in rhythm, until the rhythm itself becomes invisible. Recognizing this pattern transforms the fragments into a whole. Each intake sheet, each testimony, each archaeological find fits into the structure. The system consumed thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. Most of their names are lost, but their numbers remain. Each number marks another cycle of intake, experiment, disposal. Each jar of preserved tissue marks another fragment shipped across the empire. Each excavation site marks another pit filled with ash. The repetition multiplies, building a picture of atrocity too vast to comprehend fully, yet undeniable in its evidence. And yet, the pattern was never closed. The final entries in surviving files date to the summer of 1945. Experiments continued until the very end of the war. Prisoners were dissected as late as August, days before surrender. Fires consumed records, but not all. Ash covered bodies, but not all. Fragments survived, enough to reveal the outline of the system. The pattern does not end in 1945. It extends into the present, into the silence of archives, into the memories of survivors, into the ground where bones continue to surface. The recognition of pattern does more than describe atrocity, it indicts. It shows that what happened in Pingfang was not the work of isolated sadists, but of institutions. It shows that atrocity can be disguised as science, normalized as procedure, and multiplied through repetition until it appears ordinary. It shows that the language of data can erase the language of suffering. It shows that the rhythm of destruction can persist, hidden, until fragments resurface. The first incident was a single file. The pattern is the system that file reveals: intake, experiment, disposal, shipment, repeated until thousands disappeared. The horror lies not only in the suffering of each victim, but in the realization that their destruction was engineered, systematic, and efficient. The fragments that survive expose this rhythm piece by piece until the invisible becomes visible. And beyond the fragments, questions remain. How many files were destroyed before surrender? How many jars remain buried beneath soil? How many scientific papers still circulate, their data drawn from erased lives? The pattern is incomplete, but enough of it remains to indict. Enough remains to know that what began with one prisoner, one number, one file, expanded into an industrialized system of human consumption. The next layer of the story will reveal the full extent of this hidden economy, not only the repetition of atrocity, but the revelation of an organized trade in flesh, where prisoners were processed not merely as research subjects, but as commodities circulating across an empire of science and war. The fragments of evidence left behind by Unit 731 do not only describe cycles of intake and disposal, they hint at a system of circulation, an economy in which the human body was broken down, divided into components, and distributed through networks of science and war. The archive reveals not only how lives were extinguished, but how their remains were repurposed, transported, and exchanged. It is here, in the silent language of manifests and requisition forms, that the scale of the atrocity becomes visible. Documents reveal shipments leaving Pingfang under escort. The entries are concise: 12 specimens, 6 tissue jars, container, organs preserved. Destinations are often withheld, but when identified they include naval medical research stations, army hospitals in Nanjing and Beijing, and universities in Tokyo and Kyoto. The pattern of shipping dates suggests routine dispatches, not one-time transfers. What moved outward from Pingfang was not just data written in reports, but physical material, the dismembered evidence of human life. Survivors later described watching sealed crates being loaded into railway cars. The containers bore the markings of military cargo, stenciled codes, wax seals, armed guards. Those who carried them were instructed not to ask questions. To the casual observer, these could have been shipments of chemicals, equipment, or food supplies. Yet those who worked within the compound knew what they contained. The odor that seeped through cracks told the truth. Archaeological findings confirm this outward flow. Excavations at the periphery of the compound unearthed broken glass jars with traces of formaldehyde and fragments of human bone. Some jars bore faint inscriptions, specimen numbers, dates, abbreviated names of receiving institutions. These markings are consistent with laboratory cataloging practices of the period. Even shattered hay reveal that the material was labeled, stored, and intended for study beyond Pingfang. The ground itself preserves the ledger of a traffic in human remains. According to sealed files retrieved from post-war archives, the economy of specimens was formalized. Requests from laboratories outside Manchuria were submitted to Unit 731, specifying the type of sample required. A naval laboratory might request lungs infected with plague. A medical school might seek reproductive organs from female captives. Unit 731 supplied these on demand, extracting the requested parts during vivisections and preparing them for shipment. The language of procurement appears throughout the files. The body was no longer a victim of experimentation alone. It had become inventory. What makes this economy most disturbing is its scale. Testimony from Japanese personnel indicates that shipments occurred monthly, sometimes weekly, depending on the demand. Each shipment required dozens of victims. Thousands of lives were consumed, not only by local experiments but by the needs of distant laboratories. Pingfang functioned as a central warehouse, a hub of extraction feeding an empire-wide network. The flesh economy extended beyond organs. Blood was drawn from prisoners to test coagulation, immunity, and transfusion techniques. Leftover samples were preserved and sent to hospitals for study. Bones were harvested after death, cleaned and catalogued for anatomical collections. In some cases, entire skeletons were assembled and shipped to universities for teaching. The records describe these with chilling neutrality: full specimen, articulated. The remains of the murdered became instructional tools for students who were never told their origin. Evidence suggests barter within the military system. Surgeons in need of equipment or favors could offer specimens in exchange. A preserved organ could secure a certain shipment of medical supplies. A set of blood slides might purchase research materials. This barter was never public, never acknowledged in official budgets, but the surviving testimonies indicate it was routine. The human body reduced to fragments became currency within the empire's scientific apparatus. The bureaucracy of the flesh economy is visible in surviving catalogues. Lists of specimens record details such as organ type, preservation method, and intended recipient. In one fragment, lungs infected with anthrax are labeled for naval detachment research. In another, a set of amputated limbs is marked for frostbite study, Northern Division. Each entry resembles the record of ordinary medical samples, yet the source of each was a living prisoner. The neutral language conceals murder, transforming atrocity into inventory. The economy required concealment at every stage. Shipping manifests disguised the cargo as medical equipment. Clerks filed reports under generic titles such as biological sample transfer. The true nature of the material was hidden behind codes understood only by insiders. This secrecy ensured the circulation could continue without interference. It also ensured that decades later, fragments of truth would be difficult to piece together. Only by comparing stray manifests, testimonies, and archaeological finds can the outline of the system be reconstructed. The most chilling revelation comes from the intersection of science and strategy. According to documents recovered after the war, data from shipped specimens contributed directly to the development of biological weapons. Lungs infected with plague were used to refine methods of aerosolization. Blood samples tested resistance to toxins. Organs damaged by cholera informed techniques for contaminating wells. The flesh economy was not incidental. It was integral to the empire's plan for biological warfare. Every shipment carried not only human remains but military ambition. Survivors later described the atmosphere of the compound during shipment days. Guards enforced silence, prisoners were locked down. The air carried a metallic stench. The sound of wooden crates sliding onto railcars echoed through the yard. Those who witnessed it knew the meaning. Somewhere in some distant laboratory, their comrades' bodies would continue to be consumed. Death in Pingfang did not end at Pingfang. It traveled outward, dispersed through the veins of the empire. The trade was not limited to military facilities. Civilian universities were complicit. Faculty who received specimens cited them in scientific papers published during and after the war. The data appeared in journals under the guise of legitimate research. Students dissected cadavers without knowledge of their origin. Professors taught anatomy using skeletons assembled from the victims of Pingfang. The line between military atrocity and academic pursuit blurred until it disappeared. The flesh economy crossed the boundary between war and peace, embedding itself into the institutions of learning. Even after Japan's surrender, the economy did not fully collapse. American investigators discovered caches of preserved specimens in laboratories. Instead of destroying them, many were seized and analyzed. Some were retained for research. The immunity granted to Japanese doctors in exchange for their data extended to the specimens themselves. Victims who had been reduced to samples remained so, now circulating within Allied archives. The economy shifted from empire to occupation, its secrecy preserved under new authority. The persistence of these specimens raises questions that remain unanswered. How many jars still lie in forgotten storerooms? How many skeletons assembled from Unit 731 victims remain in university collections, mislabeled or unidentified? How many scientific papers today still cite data drawn from this economy without acknowledgement? The silence of archives conceals the extent, but the fragments that surface demand recognition. The flesh economy did not end with the fires of 1945. Its remnants circulate still, disguised within the language of science. Archaeological digs continue to expose this reality. In Harbin, beneath layers of earth, pits filled with bones have been unearthed. Some bones show saw marks, incisions, and evidence of chemical exposure. Jars containing preserved tissue have been recovered, their seals corroded but intact. These discoveries confirm that even in its final days, Unit 731 attempted to bury the evidence of its trade. Yet the earth has refused to conceal it entirely. The soil releases its fragments piece by piece, forcing confrontation with the scale of the crime. What emerges from these fragments is not a picture of random cruelty, but of organized circulation. The victims were harvested, dissected, preserved, catalogued, shipped, and studied. Each stage reveals a system in which the human body was reduced to a commodity. Each shipment, each jar, each skeleton confirms that atrocity became industry. The flesh economy was not metaphorical. It was logistical, bureaucratic, material. It transformed living people into inventory, distributed across an empire. The horror of this revelation lies not only in the suffering inflicted, but in the efficiency achieved. The body became divisible, its parts assigned value, its remnants assigned destination. Life was consumed in pursuit of data, death dispersed in pursuit of science, remains circulated in pursuit of power. The system functioned as smoothly as any supply chain. The victims were not remembered as people. They were remembered as entries in a ledger, specimens in a shipment, samples in a catalogue. And yet, the system could not erase everything. Fragments persisted. Bones in the soil, jars in forgotten storerooms, numbers etched into glass. These fragments expose the shadow network, forcing recognition of an atrocity that was meant to disappear. They show that the flesh economy was not aberration, but structure. They show that science and empire collaborated in the commodification of life. They show that the horror was not only in what was done, but in how it was normalized. The flesh economy forces a final question. If the human body could be reduced to freight, catalogued and traded, what other systems of power continue to operate in the same way? The empire of Unit 731 has fallen, but the logic of commodification persists. The unanswered files, the unclaimed specimens, the uncited data remain. The case is not closed. And beneath the silence of archives, one truth endures. The trade in human remains was not a secret anomaly, but the hidden foundation of an empire's science. But even this revelation is not the end. For after the trade collapsed, the record was not erased by accident, it was erased by design. What follows is the story of how concealment became policy, how the evidence was burned, buried, and bargained away, leaving only fragments for us to recover. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the gates of Pingfang should have opened to reveal a vast system of atrocity, yet what investigators found when they arrived was ruin. Buildings gutted by fire, files reduced to ash, laboratories stripped bare. The destruction was not the result of Allied bombing. It was deliberate. In the final days before surrender, Unit 731's commanders ordered a systematic eradication of evidence. Prisoners were executed, crematoria burned day and night, and thousands of documents were thrown into flames. The cover-up began before the war ended. Survivors later described the frenzy of those days. Prisoners who had survived months of experimentation were rounded up and executed en masse. Some were poisoned, others were shot. Many were incinerated alive to ensure silence. The Japanese staff worked without rest, dismantling equipment, smashing jars, flooding laboratories with gasoline. The goal was simple: erase every trace of the machinery of death. Yet destruction leaves its own residue. Archaeological findings confirm that beneath the ash and rubble of the burned facilities, fragments survived, glass shards from specimen jars, surgical tools warped by fire, bones buried in shallow pits. These remnants prove that even the most deliberate concealment cannot eliminate all evidence, but for decades these fragments lay hidden beneath the soil, while the official record told another story. According to sealed files later uncovered in American archives, the United States played a decisive role in preserving silence. In the aftermath of the war, U.S. intelligence officers interrogated members of Unit 731, including its commander, General Shiro Ishii. Instead of prosecuting them for war crimes, the Americans offered immunity. In exchange, they demanded the results of the experiments, the data collected from thousands of deaths, and the surviving specimens that had not been destroyed. Documents reveal that between 1946 and 1948, Unit 731's former staff handed over hundreds of pages of reports and samples. The U.S. judged this information too valuable to lose. The data promised insight into biological warfare and human physiology that Western science had never achieved. To secure this advantage, American authorities concealed the atrocities from the public. Reports describing vivisections and specimen shipments were classified. Victims disappeared from official memory, replaced by technical data buried in military archives. This exchange transformed atrocity into asset. The data harvested through the flesh economy entered the archives of Fort Detrick, the center of U.S. biological warfare research. Japanese doctors who should have faced trial at Tokyo escaped punishment. Unlike Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, Unit 731's physicians were shielded. Their crimes were hidden behind the justification of national security. The cover-up was international. The Japanese government, under American occupation, followed the same pattern. Officials rewrote records, deleted references to Unit 731, and portrayed the Epidemic Prevention Department as a routine medical unit. The Japanese press, heavily censored, published nothing about Pingfang. Public memory was sanitized, the atrocity folded into silence. When victims' families demanded answers, they were told no such unit had existed. The state colluded with the occupiers to bury the truth. The cover-up extended into academia. Japanese universities that had received specimens or data during the war continued to use them, yet no acknowledgement appeared in publications. Professors who had trained on skeletons from Pingfang never disclosed their origin. Scientific papers citing Unit 731's findings were stripped of context, presented as ordinary research. The knowledge survived. The victims were erased. The horror of this concealment lies in its effectiveness. For decades, the world knew almost nothing of Unit 731. While Nazi doctors became synonymous with atrocity, their Japanese counterparts vanished from public consciousness. Only fragments of testimony, stray reports, and unearthed bones hinted at the truth. The case appeared closed, filed away in secrecy. Yet silence cannot hold forever. By the 1980s, Japanese activists, Chinese survivors, and foreign researchers began to force open the archives. Lawsuits demanded recognition, excavations uncovered undeniable evidence, declassified American documents revealed the immunity deals. The cover-up fractured, but the decades of erasure had left their mark. Entire generations grew up ignorant of Pingfang. Families of victims died without answers. Justice delayed had become justice denied. What remains today is a paradox. The evidence is overwhelming. Bones in the earth, documents in archives, testimonies of survivors. Yet the official record remains incomplete. Many files are still sealed. Many specimens remain unaccounted for. The governments that colluded to bury the truth have never fully admitted their role. The cover-up lingers, shaping memory as much as the atrocity itself. The cover-up was not merely the destruction of evidence, it was the continuation of the flesh economy by other means. The victims' remains, data, and silence were absorbed into new systems of power. Their bodies became invisible foundations for scientific advancement, military strategy, and political expedience. The atrocity did not end with their deaths. It continued in the concealment that followed, and this concealment demands a final recognition. If governments could erase a crime of this scale, what other crimes remain hidden? How many atrocities lie buried beneath archives, concealed by immunity deals, sanitized in textbooks? The case of Pingfang is not only a story of atrocity, it is a story of how atrocity can be erased, bought and buried. But the silence of states is not the silence of the earth. Beneath the soil, bones continue to rise, and with each fragment unearthed, the shadow of Unit 731 extends into the present, refusing to remain buried. History never ends at the point where official narratives close their books. The flesh economy of Pingfang was buried in rubble, concealed in archives, and dissolved in diplomatic agreements. Yet the patterns it revealed, the extraction of human bodies as raw material, the collusion of states in silence, the transformation of atrocity into data, did not die with the war. They endure, reappearing in altered forms, embedded in modern institutions. Documents reveal that the immunity deal struck between American intelligence and Unit 731 physicians set a precedent. Knowledge obtained through atrocity could be preserved and even celebrated if it served state interests. This principle has shaped not only biological warfare research, but also the wider relationship between governments and vulnerable populations. Victims can be erased, provided the data survives. The ethical compromise of 1946 continues to echo in laboratories and courtrooms across the world. Consider the cold arithmetic of modern statistics. International organizations estimate that tens of thousands of children vanish every year into trafficking networks. Many disappear into systems that resemble the logistical shadows of Pingfang, registries erased, records falsified, guardianship reassigned without trace. While the scale and context differ, the core dynamic remains. Vulnerable bodies are repurposed for institutional needs, their disappearance rationalized through bureaucracy. Survivors later described how, in certain foster systems, children were transferred between homes with minimal documentation, rendering them invisible to oversight. The justification is often efficiency, cost reduction, or administrative streamlining. Yet the outcome is eerily familiar. People vanish inside a system designed to claim care but built to conceal. The logic that erased Unit 731's victims, bureaucratic disappearance masked as necessity, remains intact. Archaeological findings confirm how quickly physical evidence can be buried beneath development. In multiple regions, mass graves of marginalized populations have surfaced during construction projects. Bones unearthed without names, stripped of historical record. In some cases, these discoveries are quietly reburied. In others, they are documented and forgotten. The persistence of unacknowledged graves demonstrates that the silence perfected at Pingfang is not an anomaly. It is a recurring method of governance. According to sealed files released in recent decades, the US government continued to shield certain wartime data for decades after the Cold War. Reports on human experimentation remained classified well into the 21st century, long after their military relevance had expired. The secrecy was not about protecting the past, it was about protecting precedent. Admitting the truth would expose the willingness of states to collude in atrocity. To this day, the complete Unit 731 files remain incomplete, redacted, or inaccessible. The cover-up continues under the banner of national security. Modern medical ethics continues to wrestle with the data question: should results derived from atrocity be cited, replicated, or erased? Debates over Nazi hypothermia experiments parallel those over Unit 731's frostbite studies. In both cases, the central dilemma is unresolved. Does using the data perpetuate the crime, or does discarding it erase the victims twice? The lack of resolution reveals how the horror persists, not as history, but as an ongoing moral wound. The implications extend further still. Genetic research and organ trafficking in contemporary markets echo the commodification of flesh pioneered in wartime laboratories. Reports document organs extracted from prisoners and sold into transnational medical economies. Tissue samples circulate without consent. Databases of genetic information are built on populations with little ability to refuse. The transformation of the human body into a supply chain, a practice exposed in Pingfang, has not ceased. It has been globalized. The most disturbing parallel lies in the normalization of disappearance. Unit 731 operated on the assumption that certain lives could be erased without consequence. Modern systems often repeat this logic, though in bureaucratic rather than overtly violent forms. Migrants vanish in detention, children vanish in foster care, indigenous women vanish along transport routes. The state produces paperwork, yet the individuals vanish from the record. Silence remains institutional policy. Survivors of contemporary disappearances speak with the same disbelieving clarity as those who emerged from Pingfang's orbit. They describe institutions that refuse to acknowledge loss, officials who deny that transfers occurred, and archives that have been purged. The stories are distinct, but the structure of denial is constant. Unit 731's legacy is not only the horror of its experiments, it is the template of disappearance it normalized. Statistics reinforce the scale of this unresolved reality. International reports suggest over 40 million people today live under conditions of modern slavery, trafficking, forced labor, coerced exploitation. Many are unregistered, stripped of identity, untraceable by official systems. The numbers are vast, but they vanish into abstraction, much as the bodies of Pingfang disappeared into ash. The horror is not only physical, it is administrative, statistical, and silent. The persistence of unresolved archives deepens the unease. Families in China continue to search for records of relatives lost to Pingfang. In many cases, no documentation exists. Names were erased, numbers deleted, specimens catalogued without identity. The same void confronts families today seeking missing children or trafficked relatives. The gap in the record is, itself, the continuity. The absence of evidence is manufactured, designed, and defended, and so the modern implication is not merely analogy, it is continuity. Unit 731 established a pattern. Atrocities can be concealed if they serve the state. Victims can be erased if the data proves useful. Silence can be maintained if archives are sealed. That pattern remains intact in institutions across the globe. The horror is not historical, it is structural. The present reveals this with unsettling clarity. When whistleblowers expose abuses in foster care, detention centers, or medical trials, the state response mirrors that of 1945. Denial, erasure, reclassification. Records vanish, files are sealed. The truth is delayed until the moment of political irrelevance. The methods of silence perfected at Pingfang endure in the machinery of modern governance. What then is the true legacy of Unit 731? Not only the thousands who died within its walls, but the model of institutional disappearance that survives. The flesh economy has evolved into the economy of silence. The victims' bodies were once dissected, burned, and buried. Today, victims' records are deleted, archived, and obscured. The function is the same, the eradication of trace. The implications for the future are grim. If the state could erase Pingfang for half a century, how many atrocities today will only surface in the next? How many archives remain sealed, not because of national security, but because their release would reveal collusion in atrocity? How many bones lie beneath construction sites, waiting to testify? Unit 731 is not past. It is present, replicated in the persistence of secrecy, the endurance of disappearance, the transformation of bodies into data. The silence it perfected continues to shape the world, and as with Pingfang, the cover may hold for decades, but the earth remembers. Each unearthed bone, each leaked file, each survivor's testimony pushes against the seal. The question is not whether new revelations will emerge, but what they will reveal about the institutions still operating in shadow. History never closes its cases, it buries them. The records of Unit 731 were meant to vanish in fire. The bodies were meant to dissolve in ash and soil. The witnesses were meant to be silenced by poison, bullets, and secrecy. Yet silence never holds completely. Shadows leak through cracks, reasserting themselves in ways the architects of erasure cannot control. In Harbin, construction crews continue to uncover fragments of bone, twisted instruments, scorched jars. Each object is mute, yet it speaks of a system that tried to erase its own existence. Families in China still search for missing relatives, their archives empty, their questions unanswered. Across the sea, sealed files remain in American repositories, waiting for a day when the rationale for secrecy expires, or when secrecy itself collapses under its own weight. The cover-up ensured that justice would not come swiftly. Many of the perpetrators lived out their lives in comfort, holding positions of authority, their crimes protected by silence. Their victims lie unnamed, reduced to numbers, miscatalogued as specimens, or absorbed into research papers stripped of context. The imbalance remains unresolved. The persistence of absence is the most haunting legacy. We measure the atrocity not only in deaths, but in erasures. Generations passed without knowledge of what happened. Communities lost members but found no trace. The disappearance became a permanent condition. Silence was not only a tactic of war, it became a form of inheritance. Modern parallels make the shadows darker still. Children who vanish into care systems, prisoners who disappear without record, mass graves unearthed by accident. Each echo reminds us that the tools of disappearance endure. Bureaucracy remains the perfect accomplice. Archives remain malleable. States remain willing to sacrifice memory for utility. According to sealed files still withheld, the story is not finished. What has been revealed may only be a fraction. Somewhere in the locked drawers of governments and the forgotten storerooms of universities lie additional ledgers, tissue samples, photographs, and testimony. The case remains open, though institutions insist it is closed. The truth is dispersed, fragmented, half visible, and half buried. The unresolved nature of Pingfang's history is its final horror. Unlike a battlefield where bodies can be counted, unlike a massacre where graves can be mapped, Unit 731 leaves us with fragments without totality. We cannot know the full number of the dead. We cannot trace every specimen shipped, every ledger destroyed, every archive redacted. The atrocity resists completion. Its incompleteness is deliberate. And so the shadow persists. It lingers not only in bones beneath the earth or files behind locked doors, but in the structure of institutions themselves. Every sealed archive, every denial, every missing name carries the imprint of Pingfang. The laboratory may have been reduced to rubble, but its methodology, the machinery of disappearance, remains intact. The final implication is stark. The darkness still exists, not in memory, not in metaphor, but in practice. The case is not closed. It waits, unresolved, pressing against the fragile boundaries of what states allow us to know. History insists on silence. The earth insists on testimony. Between them lies the shadow in which we stand.